Hello, this is my presentation of my 3D environment. I'll be walking you through what I've done and explaining how I've done it, what I liked about it and what I thought I could have done better, and then just explaining the overall process and problems that came on the way. So my original plan for my environment was to create the McDonald's building here, and I decided to do it in the theme of the game Darksiders, because it's in like a post-apocalyptic world with like rundown buildings and everything, and I thought it would work quite well with my design and what I wanted to create with it. So I think I have achieved this quite well in my design with the if I go in here it'll be a bit easy to show the rundown elements and post-apocalyptic kind of aesthetic of the building with all the rubble on the floor and the broken bricks and everything. So compared to Darksiders, I think it matches quite a bit in that element, but also I'd say I feel like it might in some aspects be a bit too like the lighting I think might be a bit too dark compared to the game. But yeah, I think my following my original plan, I think I've stuck to it fairly well. I think I did plan to have more kind of going on outside the front of the building, whereas it's kind of all gone into the landscape behind instead. Because I did originally plan to have a kind of pathway coming from the building, but I had difficulties with the mesh painting tool and trying to get the textures to work in that, so I ended up not including that and instead decided to focus more on the landscape. Which brings me on to the next point actually. The landscape was the new idea I got from some peer feedback I received. So I was what's the word? Presenting my environment to one of my classmates, and they came up with the idea to have this environment with all the trees, and then they also showed me how to use the foliage brush so I could import one of my assets into that and then paint it across the environment, which was very useful. It saved a lot of time instead of having to copy and paste every individual tree, which was very useful because then I could also do the same with my little like ferns here and stuff. And then moving on to the planning and organization of my design, I feel like this is the one area where I lacked quite a lot. I kind of just turned up, did whatever I thought needed to be done that day, and then did the same thing the next week. Whereas if I was to do this again, I'd definitely have a more organized timetable of what needed to be done, when I was going to do it, so I could better keep track of what I was doing, which would have been very useful. Because then, obviously, with problems like the mesh painting and stuff, I would have had more time to figure that out and resolve that problem. And then other forms of organization, probably in my actual filing system and everything, with the naming conventions of all my assets, probably could have been a bit better. Especially to start with, because when I started, they were all just the default naming conventions. But yeah, but then I had to go back later on and change some of them, and even then they were pretty relatively basic names. So I probably should have done better in that regard to make it easier in future in for like industry use. Yeah, the overall process of the whole design. So obviously started sculpting in Maya, and then trying to make my building more modular was actually one of the things that I struggled with a bit, because I built the whole model originally, and then I wasn't too sure which bits to cut apart and which to make modular or not. But in the end, it was just some simple things like the railings, stairs, these little sloped banks on the side, the fences, whereas the main building itself is mainly all one piece. So the windows there I made modular. Um, but yeah, um, and then obviously exporting all of that and then putting it into Unreal and then grabbing textures from Bridge. That was really useful because then I was able to just bring them in, put the textures on. Oh wait, I forgot UV. Yes, before all that I had to UV all my models, and then there's quite a lot of problems with my UVs actually. So I kept having to go back a few times. The major problem was the scaling of the UVs and the alignment of them. So I had a problem essentially with unfolding and cutting, so I had to go back in and cut all my UVs again because they were overlapping, and then I had to realign them because the textures were all off angles, but now they're all obviously how I wanted after I resolved that problem. But then back onto the texturing, you got textures from Bridge and applied them, dragged them onto the models, and then went into the textures, changed the scaling of them in there, and then if I wanted a different scale of the same texture from the girls, I'd create like an instance of it, and then I was able to drag that onto the model. So for these trees, I dragged the texture onto the model itself in the content browser, and then obviously that texture then was assigned to that model, so I was able to create all of these with the same texture instead of having to individually put them on, which was really useful. Then I think looking back, the major hurdle I had to overcome was trying to sort my UVs out, because I had to go back a good few times to get that properly sorted. But looking back at the whole design now, I'd say I'm happy with how it's come out. I really like the lamppost design I made. I feel like the lighting works quite well with that, and just the building for the first proper 3D environment I built in Unreal. I think I've done very happy with how it's come out, and I've done a good job. I do feel like there are definitely areas in which could have been better, such as obviously I mentioned the front area of the building is a bit plain compared to the rest, but I feel like I put the time where I could have been doing that into like the landscape and everything, which does help with the overall mood of the environment. So I do think it was worth doing that. But yeah, so just explaining any assets or items I used that I didn't make. So all of the assets and everything I made in Maya and exported in. The only thing I used that wasn't mine obviously was the textures, which will be referenced and everything. So that's all good there. Yeah, I think that's everything covered. Well, thank you very much for watching my presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.